The following is a Cairo 7 Eyewitness News special presentation.
They are unforgettable, perhaps unforgivable images. As the world watches, demonstrators determined to disrupt the World Trade Organization smash windows, crash downtown, and clash with police. The sound of anarchy. The smell of tear gas.
It is incredibly painful.
And the incredible sight of Seattle under siege. 4 days that changed the way the world looks at Seattle. 4 days that changed the way we look at our city.
No violence, no gas.
4 days that changed the way we look at world trade. Tonight, a Cairo 7 special report. 4 days in Seattle. And good evening again, everyone. I'm Steve Rabel.
And I'm Susan Hutchison. It's been a week since the end of the World Trade Organization meetings. The WTO was supposed to be a shining moment for Seattle, but as we know, it didn't turn out that way.
And now many people are asking, why did it go so wrong? Here at Cairo 7, we've spent the last week looking for answers, going through hundreds of hours of videotape, talking to protesters, police, residents, and city officials. Tonight, we will share what we have learned.
We begin our search for answers with a timeline. We will take you hour by hour through the events of these 4 unforgettable days in Seattle. Our timeline starts in the early morning hours last Tuesday, as the WTO prepared for opening ceremonies and protesters prepared to shut them down.
Neil Karlinski was outside the Paramount Theater as the protesters and police began moving into position.
Before daybreak, squads of police carrying duffel bags full of gear began moving into position for the WTO's opening ceremonies. The relaxed preparations outside the Paramount Theater and Convention Center, a stark contrast to the hordes of protesters already gathering at 2 positions across town. By 7:15 a.m., police had formed the barrier they hoped might be enough to block protesters. This is how it played on live television last Tuesday morning.
They've been setting this up all morning. You can see they have made an L around the Paramount Theater here with Metro buses. This is a pretty good wall for protesters to try to get through.
By 7:30 at a staging area in Victor Steinbrook Park, protesters were ready too. Richard Thompson was there live.
This is not a sidewalk and it's not a parking lot. This is Western and Virginia, so you can see that protesters are already making their presence known here. They pretty much shut down Western Street.
Ain't no power like the power of the people.
Even before 8 o'clock, hundreds of protesters were on the go and beginning to converge from 2 opposite ends of downtown. Commuters were inevitably stuck in the middle.
It's kind of irritating me now.
It's a nightmare, and I wish they were doing it someplace else.
At intersections near the convention center, protesters were systematically beginning to shut Seattle down. Frustrated police for the first time began fighting back. They weren't very effective. While some protesters locked themselves together in the middle of the street, others dragged city fences into position to block police. Squad cars, which had already passed, now shifted into reverse to knock the fences down. Reporter Kyle Moore kept watch nearby.
Effectively, the protesters have blocked off the entire intersection here at 6th and University.
By this time, another large group finally reached the protesters' main destination, the Paramount Theater, site of the WTO's grand opening.
Let's turn the camera around here. The mesh fence that I just showed you a second ago is obviously not held up. That lasted about 10 seconds.
Seattle officials' priority 1 was already collapsing.
Are you going to take us to the convention?
Delegates were spread across town, caught in the fray, and unable to make it inside the Paramount Theater.
We couldn't get in, and the local police are not doing their job.
A view from under the wall of buses showed where delegates were trying to reach. As protesters clogged the streets surrounding the Paramount Theater, many found themselves face to face with those they came to protest.
It's a genuine effort.
Well, how much did you get paid for your point of view, though?
People were soon using ladders to climb atop the buses set up to block them. There were hundreds of protesters chanting, singing, and dancing in every direction. Police and delegates alike, it seemed, were at the mercy of the very protesters they knew were coming for months.
We're here outside the Paramount Theater, and this is the place the delegates were trying to reach.
The opening ceremonies were set to begin at 10 a.m., but only a handful of delegates were able to make it through. Take a look at this map. You have the Paramount Theater ringed by buses and demonstrators, and thousands of protesters were blocking every intersection around the convention center.
Last week, Megan Black was at the corner of 6th and Union with a group of demonstrators blockading the streets.
Approaching 10 o'clock Tuesday morning, things were getting very tense on the streets of downtown Seattle. Everywhere you looked, WTO delegates were trying to get to the convention center, and it was becoming obvious the protesters were succeeding in stopping them. Soon it also became obvious the police were becoming more aggressive. And so were the protesters as they dumped over newspaper machines. During this tense time, I was on the phone describing the scene.
Things started to turn violent. There was a lot of pushing and shoving. The protesters were getting shoved to the ground by riot police. And then everyone started chanting, as you might be able to hear them outside right now, no violence.
We have now learned that during Tuesday morning's protests, Seattle police had planned massive arrests. But now some officers tell us they were not only surprised by the sheer numbers of protesters, but they were horribly unprepared to make those arrests. Simply, police were overwhelmed and resorted to force to clear the massive crowds.
And your failure to leave the area will subject you to arrest for failure to disperse.
The crowd did not disperse. A few minutes after 10 Tuesday morning, as promised, police took action to clear the streets, first blanketing protesters in pepper spray. Then came the first of what would be many crowd-controlled tear gassings. My photographer and I got caught in a cloud of gas.
Let's move it over our coverage to 6th and Union, where Megan Black is. Megan, are you on the phone? And what's happening at your location?
I'm sorry. There's like massive tear gas here. We gotta go. They're rushing us away. The tank is moving through the streets right now. I'm sorry. I tried to talk, but I can't. The tear gas is really powerful.
All right, Megan.
I can't talk.
With our eyes stinging and tearing, choking and coughing, we tried to get away from the gas, along with many of the protesters. But even with the pain of the tear gas, some of those protesters still refused to leave the streets. This scene was repeated many times at this intersection, and protesters stood their ground, adamant to stop the WTO meetings.
This was the scene inside the Paramount Tuesday morning, a nearly empty hall. Opening ceremonies were being delayed.
Back outside, Kyle Moore was a block away from Megan. He was at 6th and University. As we continue our timeline, Kyle catches up with a group of protesters who were standing their ground.
These groups have locked themselves in to concrete pipes.
It's nearly 8 a.m. when environmental protesters swarmed the intersection of University and 6th Avenue. I stood just across the street.
Well, a lot of those delegates aren't getting into the convention center. I'll show you why.
With arms linked, these men and women formed a human wall to stop delegates in their tracks.
Because WTO, the corporate heads of the world, are trying to rape and plunder the rest of what's left of our natural resources.
Earth First just moved in with this large inflatable sperm whale. They blocked off the whole intersection.
Others used themselves as blockade.
As you can see, this is a concrete right here. Their arms are actually fastened into these concrete containers.
It gets a little uncomfortable. I could have dressed better, but it's worth it. You know, we gotta do whatever to get heard.
Delegates definitely got an earful.
I'm trying to learn from these nice folks here who are committed to a cause. And rather than walk around and avoid them, I thought I'd engage them in conversation.
It's after 10 a.m. Megan Black is just a block away, caught in a tear gas cloud. 20 minutes later at 10:25 a.m., officers here decide they'd had enough. Donning gas masks and riot gear, the officers move to take back the intersection. They move in on hula hooping and praying protesters.
here. They just set off the first tear gas right here. We're going to back up a little bit. Our shot's going to get a little shaky, but tear gas, we're going to try to cover ourselves.
Protesters scattered. Within 30 seconds, I was overcome by the gas.
It's a very painful smell. Let's just watch this for a second.
It took several minutes to recover.
I am able to talk now. That tear, they set off a sec. Yeah, you see, my eyes are watering a little bit for the tear gas, and I feel it in my lungs.
Most of the demonstrators were knocked down by the gas.
You were prepared, obviously, today, huh?
You know, I'm ready for whatever's going to happen. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to say what I have to say.
During the chaos, the first arrest and more pepper spray. However, protesters continue to block anyone trying to enter.
Right now, state troopers are trying to make a pathway through the protesters to get through, but as you can see,
after a tug of war, the man makes it to the other side, albeit a little shaken.
At noon, the streets were still in chaos. The downtown area was shut down.
The Secret Service decided it was just too dangerous to move Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky from their hotel rooms at the Westin Hotel.
So far, things were going pretty much the way the protesters had hoped. And then, right where we're standing, suddenly something happened that the protesters didn't expect.
A gang of anarchists hit the Starbucks at Pacific Place. Then they hit the Seafirst Bank, doubled back on 5th, trashing stores in Westlake Center. They turned on Pine, hitting more targets.
And Megan Black saw it all. After being gassed, Megan had moved to 6th and Pine for the start of the anarchist rampage.
Protesters had been tear-gassed all morning. Finally, there was a lull in the activity when all of a sudden a group we had seen all morning, a group we now know as anarchists called the Black Bloc, began terrorizing the city. I was live on the phone as it started.
Trying to break the windows. They're slamming against the window. Oh my gosh, they just broke the Starbucks window. They're breaking into it right now. I'm moving across the street.
It was a frightening moment, and I think I was in shock. I had been separated from my photographer, but as I followed this group, I soon met up with another Cairo photographer, Frank Simon, as the group's rage turned toward him. Photographer Eric Wald and I then followed the Black Bloc. There were about 30 of them, isolated by their black clothing, black hoods and masks. It was obvious as they continued their destruction that they were renegade protesters.
Yeah, take off the mask. Take off your mask and join the rest of us and shut up!
And now we're at the McDonald's at 3rd and Pine where they are breaking more windows. They broke windows at the Gap. They're smashing windows at McDonald's. They're dumping over garbage cans. And they are very angry again and hostile. We're seeing more clashes with other protesters telling them to stop because they're giving everyone a bad name. None of the protesters, the legitimate protesters down here, want any of this kind of action, and they are very angry.
So right now, knocking at the newspaper.
Megan, any sign yet of police trying to track them down?
No police anywhere. They're breaking the bank window here at U.S. Bank. We got to get out of here. We're going to run up the street because if they see us, they attack us. And so we're keeping a safe distance away from them.
Several police officers have told us because they were assigned to control the protest crowds, they weren't allowed to break ranks and to stop the Black Bloc. So the group just continued destroying property for nearly an hour. Anarchist Daniel Burton Rose says he didn't take part in the violence, but he cheered the Black Bloc on. He says the destruction is a political message targeting capitalism and attempting to eliminate it.
Destroy the stuff that you feel oppresses you. I mean, as an anarchist, you try to make a commitment to confront, like, domination everywhere you see it.
What gives you the right to destroy what other people enjoy?
What gives these people the right to always be invading our space? Like, I don't think there's a neutral.
But it's against the law.
You know, I mean, resisting is against the law. Like, we know that.
So with disregard to any consequences, the Black Bloc continued the violence. During the rampage, Mayor Paul Schell says he realized something had to be done. He then called in the National Guard.
All of that violence took place here on Pine Street, the site of Tuesday's biggest and most peaceful march of the day.
The Labor March was the event that everyone feared would shut down the city on Tuesday afternoon. In the end, it was overshadowed by other, more chaotic events of the day.
The Labor March was one of the biggest protests in Seattle since the 60s. Chris Lagares provided our coverage.
People united will never be defeated.
They came by the busload to Memorial Stadium. United Farm Workers from California, steel workers from Cleveland, Ohio.
I took my vacation to come out here.
A pilot from Washington, D.C.
We're here to protect our jobs.
Construction workers wearing hard hats, mingling with environmentalists wearing green. All of them saying no to the WTO despite their widely diverse backgrounds.
Here we are, we're all together. Pat Buchanan and Jimmy Hoffa. Can you believe that?
Hell no! Hell no!
Even more unbelievable to some was the size of this crowd as it marched downtown. An estimated 40,000 people.
The city of Seattle has literally been overrun by marchers.
Our own Cairo anchors noting the numbers as we carried the parade live.
Well, obviously, I would say if union members from around the country came here to make a statement, they are succeeding.
And as they marched, we listened to their complaints against this World Trade Organization.
They're basically making plans to figure out how they're going to divide up the world.
They want to offload our work to foreign countries for cheaper labor.
We're not against world trade, the rules of world trade. We're against world trade without rules. And that's what we have right now.
What do we want? Stop slavery, Burma!
With their chants and signs, they condemn child and slave labor, demanding better wages and working conditions in third world nations, human rights and human dignity.
Jim Hoffa.
How you doing?
Good. We're live on Cairo television.
Oh, great.
This has been a massive demonstration.
Unbelievable.
What do you attribute it to?
Well, I think the dedication of the workers here, the brothers and sisters.
And they brought in some of the most powerful names in organized labor to state their case. We talked to the head of the Teamsters live.
It's not fair what they're doing to the WTO. We've got to make sure that everybody participates in what's going on. We've got to have better labor standards, and we've got to make sure that labor and environmentalists have a seat at the table.
For sheer spectacle, Seattle has never seen anything like it. A giant condom going down the street, urging the WTO to practice safe trade. Topless women chanting, "This is what democracy looks like." A coalescence of interest, Jim Hoffa called it, all worried that the WTO is putting corporate greed over human needs.
They're not for their workers, they're for themselves, they're for corporate.
Despite appearances, the rest of the downtown streets were hardly peaceful during the labor march. Thousands of demonstrators were still blocking the streets, refusing to move.
Neil Karlinski was with a huge crowd at 4th and Pike when police finally made their move to clear the streets.
To say the first day of the WTO ended with a bang may be the understatement of the year. The scene was 4th and Pike, right in the very heart of downtown.
Threw my hands like this and I said peace, like that. And all of a sudden, boom, I get hit in the chest with a tear gas canister. I couldn't even move. I was on the ground like this.
It all began when a few protesters tried to bust through the lines of police. For roughly the next 3 hours, photographer Mark Marash and I took up position atop these newspaper stands. This is the direction we were looking, but this is what we saw. As it played out on the air, the closest live picture was down the street. We did our best using a cell phone to broadcast.
People in the streets are throwing things, large wooden blocks, back at the police officers.
From roughly 3 to 6 p.m., protesters burned garbage dumpsters, taunted police, and generally refused to vacate what should have been one of the busiest intersections downtown. One protester simply put himself at the front of the group and sat down, defying police. As people looked on from office windows up above, those blinded by tear gas were led away.
We will maintain this intersection. They cannot move us if we are seated.
At one point, the crowd swelled to such proportions you had to look hard just to see the line of police on 4th Avenue. The group, which formed to protest the WTO, was now reacting angrily to a new target. The police who had blocked their advance and who are now trying to clear them using every piece of non-lethal weaponry at their disposal.
They are shooting tear gas with no warning or nothing.
Finally, just past 5 o'clock, police set out to clear the intersection regardless of who got in the way. While one line of officers stood their ground, a second line of police advanced from Pike Street, firing tear gas and flashbangs, even shooting rubber bullets as they advanced.
This country is full of sons of bitches!
An angry crowd retreated amidst heavy tear gas, and we did too. After running for blocks in every direction away from police, weary protesters littered the sidewalks.
Oh, God.
By just past 5:30, police had cleared the intersection of everything but smoldering trash dumpsters. This was how the sun set on the WTO's opening day.
As riot police were clearing the downtown streets, Mayor Schell, Governor Locke, and King County Executive Ron Sims held a joint news conference. After turning down an offer to call up the National Guard earlier in the day, Mayor Schell announced his new plan to restore order.
Declared an emergency, a state of emergency for the city. That allows us to do a number of things. One is to request the governor for some help from the National Guard, which I've done. It allows us to impose a curfew from 7 in the morning until daybreak.
But an order from the mayor was hardly going to clear the streets. Tuesday night saw more looting. Police pushed demonstrators out of the restricted area, past here, up Pine Street, into Capitol Hill. Deborah Horn was there for that first violent night of civil emergency.
With orders to clear out downtown Seattle, the police began their final assault on protesters on Pine Street near 8th Avenue. It was 10 minutes after 6 Tuesday night. The state of emergency was just an hour old.
We're now getting a little bit of the tear gas that was thrown just a moment ago because we are right here at this intersection.
Some protesters taunted police officers who silently stood their ground, their sole focus on moving the protesters out. It was nearly 6:30.
There was disruption by just a few hundred people.
Far from the chaotic streets of Seattle, Governor Gary Locke was hosting a dinner for the WTO delegates at the Museum of Flight as they socialized. Canisters of pepper spray were being released, sending police and protesters fleeing. In another part of downtown, a bonfire raged. There were no police to stop it.
We're going to pick up the truck when they get out of his range.
The police were still blocks away on Pine Street, still firing canisters on the crowd. Incredibly, my photographer, Bill Skoke, continued taking pictures, even as the pepper spray made it difficult for him to see. And the police kept coming. But at 6th and Stewart, a new chaos broke out. It was 7:15. Protesters had turned their anger on Starbucks, breaking windows, looting the store. A protester tried to stop the melee because, again, there were no police officers anywhere. By then, the police had reclaimed Pine Street, having pushed protesters out. Tear gas filled the air as downtown Seattle lay eerily in the distance.
That was the end of the first day, but Wednesday would not bring calm.
In fact, it brought the president and a whole new set of problems. Our timeline continues when we come back.
But first, you've been seeing our reporters in front of the cameras. Now and through the rest of this broadcast, you'll hear the personal reflections of the people who took those incredible pictures.
All you can do is videotape what's in front of you, and I had, one protester that was kind of getting things going, trying to block traffic. I was videotaping him, and he made a point of stopping me, putting his hand over the lens. Nothing makes us angrier as a photojournalist is someone assaulting us, stopping us from doing our work.
This is what Seattle looked like Wednesday morning. The day brought hundreds of arrests in Westlake Center as protesters were carried off and dragged off by police. As night falls, a different law enforcement uniform is seen on the streets. The camouflage uniform of the Washington National Guard, called in to help keep the peace. We're standing at Westlake Center.
On Wednesday morning, this shopping mall was inside what is commonly called the no protest zone.
The whole downtown core was off limits to anyone who wanted to block streets or buildings. That set off mass arrests. Christina McKenna picks up our timeline on Wednesday morning.
Did she say we have pains? No,
Wednesday morning, the sun rose to find Seattle a city changed. Citizens tried to repair the damage, and so did the mayor.
Lots of discussions. I'm happy to report that the downtown is peaceful.
Yet in the midst of that morning peace, it seemed clear the conflict wasn't over yet. By 7:30, a handful of protesters were making their way toward the city core. Police had defined their no protest zone, but even outside that, they wouldn't allow city streets to be blocked. Once again, what was a protest against the WTO became one against police.
Wait. Sir, I understand what you're saying. Back that way.
This is what democracy looks like.
The mass arrests filled city buses and yet still fell short of stopping the wave of those determined to march on downtown. Within the hour, an impromptu parade had penetrated the downtown core. The first to reach Westlake Plaza told police they expected to be arrested, and they were. But as the people kept coming, it was clear to those of us at the scene, not all of them were protesters.
There are a lot of people here. I don't think all of them are the WTO demonstrators.
Still, those who blocked the walkways were arrested just the same.
I am not struggling at all. I am not struggling. I am peaceful. Remove your knee from my neck.
But for every protester police dragged away, another one seemed to sit down. Soon it became clear police who set out to prevent a disturbance were now causing one. And that's when one field commander stepped forward to do something no one expected. Walking between his own officers, Lieutenant Andy Tuke told protesters, "We're out of here." And with that, they were.
It looks like they have retreated, and they are now letting these demonstrators take over this plaza at Westlake Center.
While the arrested protesters were bused to Sandpoint, Mayor Schell held another news briefing. He was asked about the conduct of some police officers clearing the streets the night before, and his answer touched some nerves.
I will acknowledge it hurts when you get hit by a non-lethal weapon and when you have to deal with tear gas. I don't like it, and I apologize for those innocent citizens who had to suffer that.
Later, the mayor said he did not mean to criticize any of the officers.
President Clinton had arrived at Boeing Field in the middle of the night. We now know the Secret Service considered canceling the visit until they got assurances the president would be safe. There was heavy security everywhere the president went, and there were no attempts to arrest or remove any protesters for the 4 hours Mr. Clinton was in public view.
Sharon Alfonsi continues our timeline with coverage of the President's Day here in Seattle.
12:01 downtown.
Here it is as we see the president's motorcade leaving.
The presidential motorcade makes its way through downtown Seattle. Reporter Brian Wood is at the Four Seasons Hotel. The streets are strangely quiet.
Today, downtown is a very different scene from yesterday.
It is truly my pleasure to introduce to you the President of the United States, Bill Clinton.
But the president couldn't avoid the subject of demonstrators and violence on the streets. After a handshaking session with farmers, traders, and shippers at the Port of Seattle, the president talks to me about the last 36 hours.
And I don't think anybody in America should take what a few violent people did as in any way representative of this community or of the people who are here for peaceful protest. We just ought to condemn what they did.
1:18 p.m., the event at the port is over, and in a live interview, Governor Gary Locke tells us the streets are safe. Do you think the situation downtown right now is under control? What's your feeling?
I'm very pleased that the order has been restored to downtown Seattle. People are working, people are shopping, delegates are moving about freely, and I really believe that people should feel safe to come downtown and shop in the stores and get their Christmas shopping. The lines are very, almost non-existent.
Non-existent because they are replaced by these lines. It's 1:30 now, and police have formed a solid blue barrier around the Four Seasons, the president's next stop.
The protesters are blocks and blocks away from here right now.
Moments later, Clinton is safely inside the hotel addressing WTO trade ministers.
But in a free society, people want to be heard. And human dignity and political reality demand it today.
Steelworkers march from the Labor Temple to Pier 62.
Let me thank you for coming out in this rotten weather.
Just before 3 o'clock now.
Dump it! Dump it! Dump it!
And workers dump fake steel into Elliott Bay, protesting the dumping of foreign steel in U.S. markets. Coast Guard ships keep a close eye on protesters. Police keep guard around the Four Seasons.
The scene that you see here is quiet.
It will prove to be the calm before the storm.
The president wrapped up his speech at the Four Seasons around 4 o'clock on Wednesday. As the president's limo pulled away, police resumed their push to clear the streets in downtown. Ross McLaughlin was a block away from the Pike Place Market as the police started cracking down.
Your conduct is a violation of state and city law.
Police were moving into place in all corners of downtown Seattle. It appeared they were trying to clear the streets for the presidential motorcade, which was on its way to the Westin Hotel.
We were hit with tear gas just a short while ago.
Cairo 7 Eyewitness News reporter Richard Thompson was a block from the hotel, and he, like others in the area, got a taste of the gas. And then, just a few minutes later, we got it too, as police moved into the area of the Pike Place Market to contain protesters who had been pushed back from the Westin. And for the next 10 minutes, it was chaos. This woman went down, but police kept coming at her with pepper spray.
Okay, rather than me screaming, I'm just...
Do you want someone's hand to hold on to?
21-year-old Natalie got a painful dose of pepper spray, too.
Police are coming at me with...
And so did I, but we stayed on the air.
He's after our photographer, Eric Alexander.
Let's go! Let's go!
And all the while, choking gas filled the air. And it wasn't just protesters who were targeted. Police fired pepper spray at anyone who got in their way. Mike Kelso, who was just trying to protect his business, got caught up in it all.
They're burning, my throat's fried, and my lungs are burning.
The protesters, about 300 of them, are gathered behind me at Pike Place Market. It looks like they're ready to square off again.
The crowd had been pushed to the entrance of the Pike Place Market, but riot police were not going to let them stay.
We were chanting, "No more violence," and all of a sudden they opened up with the pepper spray and the tear gas, I suppose, and I got hit in the eye with one of them rubber bullets. I was stunned. I was shocked. It hurt really bad, and I had to run off, you know.
You're shooting at innocent citizens!
And by 6 o'clock, the crowd had been moved from the Pike Place Market.
6:42 p.m. The gas had driven most of the protesters out of the downtown area, but there were still scattered groups like this one, sitting in the middle of 3rd and Pine, a peaceful act of civil disobedience that ended just before the 7 p.m. curfew took effect.
And we decided to march peacefully away from here before curfew at 6:45.
Then we watched one of the most surreal events of the week. With sirens blaring and lights flashing, dozens of police cruisers raced through the downtown core. They call this a wild weasel operation, a show of force to clear the streets. Wednesday night, it worked.
7 p.m. This was the scene near the Westin Hotel. Seattle City Councilman Richard McIver says he tried to get into the restricted area to attend a WTO reception at the Westin. Police pulled McIver from his car and threatened him with arrest, even though he showed them his business card and ID.
And the officer explained to me in rather shoddy terms that they were busy escorting public officials into downtown Seattle. What did he think I was? He didn't care. None of them cared.
MacGyver says the incident points to what he calls systematic racism within the police department. Investigations are already underway.
It took hours to clear downtown on Wednesday night.
But just like the night before, the last group was pushed past the Paramount Theater, up Pine Street, all the way to Capitol Hill.
But on Wednesday night, the conflict on Capitol Hill had little to do with the WTO. It was a battle over a neighborhood. Here's Kevin McCarty.
Nothing would be better if we sat right here.
Forced from downtown by police as curfew descends, an angry crowd of demonstrators mixed with residents near Broadway and Pine Streets. The battle for Capitol Hill begins. Police now face a standoff. The crowd, almost exclusively residents of the Hill, who won't back down.
It's become an ego issue from my point of view. I think if we can kind of maybe just retreat a little bit, both parties can just, you know, call it a night.
The whole city is watching this street. Moving back and forth between the crowd and the cops, King County Councilman Brian Derdowski tries to make peace.
Now you guys got to cut me a little slack, okay?
The police hold the line as some members of the crowd test their authority.
I'm asking you to voluntarily and peacefully move westbound and disperse.
You guys move back 20 feet and stay back from our line 20 feet.
Hey, let's go that way. Let's do something else.
After several hours, Derdowski's efforts to calm the angry crowd fails. Desperate, he tries to convince police to back down.
Sir, you know, in the last few hours we've been here, we took this whole block of steps backwards.
I know you did. I know you did. I appreciate, you know something? I appreciate your restraint. I appreciate what you did.
Okay, sir, will you please clear the area?
I will.
It's been nearly 7 hours. Police patience finally runs out. With the crowd taunting them, the officers make their move. As police move in on the crowd, photographer Jan Kuahara and I become trapped, trying to escape the assault while continuing reporting.
Okay, we're going. Please, we're going. Sorry. Okay, where do you want? Tear gas in the air.
At that point, the camera goes dead, and we become lost in the smoke and tear gas.
Jan needs help. Where's he at?
Jan is now blinded by the tear gas. I was hit by pepper spray.
I received a shot directly in the eyes. It is incredibly painful.
Police retake Capitol Hill, but some say amid the tear gas and rubber bullets, they lost credibility. For many, the violent climax of the battle for Capitol Hill is the last straw.
Tuesday and Wednesday, 2 days Seattle won't soon forget. After the events of those 2 days, the city decided to close down downtown altogether. City leaders decided that no one would be allowed in the core of downtown without the proper credentials. And then Thursday brought a little bit of peace to Seattle. Megan Black covered the events of that day.
This is not a police state!
After 2 days and 2 nights of violence, tear gassing, and rioting, hundreds of protesters vowed they would not be silenced. So they decided to break the law by entering the city-imposed no protest zone by marching through the streets from Capitol Hill to the Pike Place Market. City leaders didn't want any more violence either, so they gave the group a police escort this Thursday, all to get their message across.
I think the violence needs to stop, but we need to be heard.
I'm just here to help out and support and hopefully shut down the WTO.
This is what democracy looks like!
And without incident, the group joined several hundred already at the market for the farmers' rally.
That's what we are here today to do, is to make the merchants of greed accountable.
Once again, with a police escort, at least 1,000 protesters marched and sang. They ended up at the King County Jail, where they circled the jail, chanting one demand.
Let them go! Let them go! Let them go!
The protesters were demanding the release of 500 or so protesters behind bars.
Protesting for the people that are here in the jail because I don't think it's fair that they were arrested yesterday.
At one bizarre point, a small part of the crowd turned on itself as a fight over the American flag broke out. One person wanted to rip it down. Another, a union worker, fought to send it right back up the pole. The union worker won.
The people united will never be divided.
With the huge protest crowd still growing at the jail, just across the street at City Hall, the already embattled Mayor Paul Schell stepped out for a look, still wondering how he could disperse this crowd peacefully. But the crowd in a block party mode stayed for hours. The jail locked down. Jailers stuck until the protesters left. And finally, a breakthrough after negotiations between the mayor and the attorneys for the jailed protesters.
So what the jail authorities agreed to do after the mayor called them is to let us meet in groups. That way we can come to an agreement and we can finally confirm a plea bargain.
And that was enough to send the 1,000 or so protesters marching back up to Capitol Hill. There was no tear gas, no police confrontation. These protesters say this proves that violence is not necessary.
Friday, the protesters were back at the jail, and some demonstrators stayed the weekend until almost everybody who was arrested in the protest had been released. Well, that ends our WTO timeline. 4 remarkable days in Seattle.
That timeline helps us understand what happened, and now we turn our attention to why. We talked to Seattle's police chief and mayor after this.
Police were moving protesters away from the intersection near the Westin, and one protester had taken a direct shot of pepper spray in his face. And so I was rolling on that image, and then all of a sudden in my ribs, I got a riot club from one of the officers. And I turned towards him just kind of naturally, and from my blind side, another officer got me in the ribs again, and down I went to the ground. And I didn't know what would happen after that, but at that moment, my coworker, my reporter, Todd Pottinger, steps in with his gas mask on and picks me up off the pavement, and we kept going.
Protesters promise a battle in Seattle, but few expect a war.
I think it could enrich all of our lives if it goes right.
In the optimism the week before, there are banners and bantering.
People before profit.
Signs and symbols and early warnings that the city's version for Seattle
we will be remembered, and Washington State, Seattle will be on the map.
Is not the vision the world will remember after 4 days in Seattle.
So what happened here? Why did the WTO convention turn out so differently than anybody expected?
The city was surprised, but perhaps they shouldn't have been. Reporter Neil Karlinski looks at how the warning signs were clearly there from the start.
Look familiar? It's not Seattle, but London this past June, where protesters took to the streets to march against virtually the same people the WTO brought to Seattle. You can see police in riot gear pushing against the crowds. What you can't see is the tear gas and violence that broke out. That video was confiscated by British authorities. Seattle police knew this was just a small sampling of what would be headed our way.
Take your time climbing and keep that thing right up there in front of you.
Great.
And they also knew about these training facilities set up north of Seattle where protesters from across the country were gathering to train.
The World Trade Organization is enough of a threat to democracy and to our health and environmental laws that it's worth putting our lives on the line if that's what it takes.
The warning signs of things to come were everywhere. The anarchists police were told would be headed to Seattle put on a virtual dress rehearsal in their hometown of Eugene, Oregon, when they rioted in the streets. Police had to use tear gas to clear them, but the damage was already done. Even here in Seattle, before the conference got underway, protesters went public with their plans on television.
Folks will use the U-lock, most likely around their neck or ankles or other places, connect it with other people, probably blockading a street, either probably laying down on each other.
If after all this, police had any doubt at all, what happened at this Seattle McDonald's should have been a wake-up call. A peaceful march through downtown ended in chaos, and the conference was still a day away. Protesters told us after the fact the police reaction is not what they expected.
I was surprised by how poorly prepared the police in the city were.
Certainly the police had a lot of armored vehicles and helicopters and tear gas. I don't call that preparations.
Make no mistake, peaceful protests and marches shut Seattle down, and violent anarchists caused extensive damage. But none of it should have been a secret to those who brought the WTO to Seattle.
What did the police expect? What was their plan? And where did things go so terribly wrong? A number of ongoing investigations are already looking for the answers. Reporter Karen O'Leary tries to get to the bottom of the police plan.
Until it started. Until this happened. Seattle police leaders thought they were ready for the WTO.
Quite frankly, I'd like to think that downtown Seattle will be the safest place to be that particular week.
Months of planning and meeting with protest groups led Assistant Police Chief Ed Joyner to downplay predictions of violence.
They're talking about 100,000 protesters coming to Seattle, bent on death and destruction and so forth. And I quite frankly don't put a lot of stock in that.
Maybe not 100,000, but so many demonstrators did come to Seattle that police were soon in over their heads. Seattle police did have a plan, and early Tuesday morning, when the marching was just starting, it still seemed plausible. The idea was to go ahead and allow demonstrators to take over intersections around the convention center, then move in, making mass arrests so that WTO delegates could get into the conference. What killed the plan? The sheer size of the crowd.
You have 5 minutes in which to clear the intersection.
What we also see here is a police force that's desperately outnumbered.
Police simply didn't have enough staffing to make mass arrests. With intersection after intersection now filling up, police leadership turned to Plan B. Clearing the crowds with tear gas. But it didn't work either. Protesters wouldn't disperse, and officers who'd been ordered not to break ranks stood by and watched. Nicole Rodriguez was at 4th and Pike.
The police are standing still in their riot gear, not doing anything right now. I think
that inability to act was demoralizing to many officers. Later, the police guild blasted top brass.
Can't have command coming out of a basement someplace.
Officers complained about lack of equipment. Despite months of planning, some felt ill-prepared.
We were trained at the last minute, more or less. We would have liked to have more training.
On Wednesday, everything would be different. Mayor Schell called in the National Guard. Officers cracked down and made the mass arrests even demonstrators had expected. And top leaders admitted mistakes.
Clearly, in hindsight, the approach that we used yesterday did not work.
In the aftermath of the violence, some police leaders claimed the protesters had misled them. The protest leaders insist they made their goal crystal clear: to shut down the WTO.
Now, I don't know how that was perceived, and I cannot know how that was perceived by the police. But whether they thought it meant colorful signs and some very clever chants, they were very, very wrong.
As for Assistant Chief Joyner, despite all the criticism, he's standing by his plan.
I'm very confident that the plan itself will withstand very close scrutiny and come out as a shining example of how this kind of plan should be put together.
One of the first casualties of those 4 unforgettable days in Seattle was Police Chief Norm Stamper.
He announced his retirement a few days ago, but he will be staying on the job until all the WTO investigations are completed. I sat down and talked with the chief this morning.
I think it's time for the coolest heads to prevail under these circumstances, and for people to recognize that we're all about the business now, finding out what went right, what went wrong, what we could do more of, what we could do less of. We have an absolutely outstanding police department, and I think the critical analysis of the week's activities will in fact show that it was planned for as well as it could be, and that the cops performed in an absolutely superlative fashion.
The images that we see.
Yes.
Some disturbing, even to you. You mentioned it the very first day. I don't know if you backtracked on it a little bit, but you clarified your statement about what you saw in very isolated incidents.
Sure.
How do those get explained to the public?
Well, they get explained, I think, this way. If I see an image that is disturbing to me, it is probably because an individual police officer who may have been out there on the streets for 16 or 18 hours has broken ranks. And if I see isolated only that image, I don't see what provoked it, I'm in no position to really judge it. Is it a disturbing image? Of course it is. Is it a disturbing image to have individuals who are completely innocent, who may have been dining on Capitol Hill, who were not part of the protest, violent or nonviolent at all, getting a face full of gas? Well, and the answer is yes. And we can say, you know, we're sorry for your experience, but we don't apologize for the tactics and the strategies we used.
Now that you've had a little bit of time to stand back and look at this, would you have changed anything in the planning process?
Well, if I could have somehow invented a police agency of 2 to 3 times the size of the Seattle Police Department, I would have. I don't mean to trivialize a very important issue here, but it's very clear that the intensity of feeling, the breadth and depth of anti-WTO sentiment that was being expressed on our streets, combined with some folks I think who are out there for recreational destructiveness as well as a political strategy of committing acts of vandalism and violence, had this demonstration or the week's worth of both nonviolent and criminal behavior taken place in a city the size of New York with 40,000 cops, the outcome clearly could have been and probably would have been different.
There were some things said after all this, specifically about leadership, your leadership of the police department. How did that affect you? How has it affected you? What have you said to your police officers, many of whom questioned what's happened over the last week, and in some cases questioned your tenure during your time as chief?
Sure. That's not the first time that's been questioned. And what I say to them is that I am terribly proud of them. They have every right to be proud of what they did and no need to be defensive about what they did. I think they performed in an extraordinarily effective way, restraint, discipline, personal courage in the face of extreme danger on so many different occasions. So they did a terrific job. If they say to me, Chief, we didn't have enough people, we didn't have enough sport, we didn't have a hot meal, I do take that personally. You know, I got a lot of people saying, well, don't apologize for anything. You know, the police department did as good a job as it could possibly do. My own personal sense of responsibility is we need to do everything we can to provide support to our police officers. And if I didn't, I'm really sorry about that.
Chief Norm Stamper earlier today. Now, the chief is not the only one being asked some tough questions by the people of Seattle.
The mayor's actions during the protests are also under scrutiny. I'll talk with Seattle Mayor Paul Schell when we come back.
Plus, many people are still disturbed by the images of police cracking down on protesters. Coming up, we take a much closer look at the use of force by local police.
I got gassed 5 times. I was there when the first gas went off. I'm not even sure where it was. The cops pushed me back down a block. And, I ran back to the truck and fed that tape in. And just as I was doing that, they were gassing that intersection. And I did that twice, and I got gassed twice there.
We'd been up on the hill for an hour or two when all hell really broke loose. You know, I was completely disoriented due to the gas that was being used, and got the overspray from a coworker that, you know, was sprayed directly in the face. Stumbled about, trying to make my way somewhere. And luckily, a coworker, Margot Kim, came to my rescue.
One of the issues that people are still talking about is the conduct of the police.
Some feel the officers showed incredible restraint, but there have been a number of incidents where the use of police force is being questioned. Here's Brian Wood.
Despite overwhelming odds, questionable planning, and limited resources, Seattle's mayor and police chiefs say the vast majority of officers handled themselves properly, but not all. In their efforts to protect life and property, to keep the streets clear and safe, even the police chief says he has some questions about the behavior of some officers.
I saw circumstances that are in fact troubling to me.
They were plainclothes police officers. They had no warning. They came at us from behind.
Kayla Economos says she was the victim of police brutality.
I felt my head being smashed against the concrete sidewalk. I felt my teeth being pushed in, felt blood running everywhere.
Protesters were the target and they were hit, but so too were others. The woman behind the video camera in this car was doing a school project when a King County Sheriff's deputy asked her to roll down the window and then pepper sprayed her and her friend.
I think that definitely makes me frown upon the police department and how they handled everything, because there was children out there watching and learning.
She has since filed a claim against the county. But most outrageous to many was what some call indiscriminate attacks on passersby, just folks in the neighborhood.
We are residents! There was no protesters! None of us are protesters here!
Police response to his outburst? Blast to the face.
The riotous behavior I saw was by the Seattle Police Department, the Washington State Patrol, and the Federal Bureau of Investigations.
And with this overflow meeting, the Seattle City Council began to hear the angry reaction to police tactics.
The police response to this was to target the nonviolent blockaders with chemical warfare.
The medics were targeted, shot from behind with rubber bullets, had pepper spray applied at point-blank range.
That the possibility that what we saw in Capitol Hill and downtown reflects a police culture that doesn't trust minorities or youth or anyone who isn't like them.
But it is a culture, police say, of self-criticism. And so the Seattle Police Department has an internal affairs unit investigating the behavior of officers. A handful of complaints have already been filed.
One of the lasting images of these 4 days in Seattle is a sign that read, "Turtles and Teamsters together," opposition groups that have never stood together before. Essex Porter has more on how this week's protest made for some strange bedfellows.
Oh, hey, hey. Oh, oh. Teamsters marching next to turtles, some of America's most conservative union members, side by side with environmental activists.
That's what WTO in Seattle did. It gave community, the labor community, the religious community, the environmental community, the human rights community, the student community, the fair trade community, a reason to come together and develop a coalition.
A broad protest coalition rarely seen since anti-war activist Tom Hayden led mass demonstrations in the 1960s.
The WTO, which was unknown in America yesterday, is going to be a household word, and it's going to be a bad word. So I think the protest has succeeded in delegitimizing this fairly invisible government that's been affecting us.
Wherever they go now in a democratic society, I think they're going to be met with questions about what it stands for.
The protests outside were mirrored more quietly inside, where 4 days of talks collapsed under the weight of division between richer and poorer nations.
Issues that remained were highly complicated, and we believed could not be overcome rapidly.
Those who cheered the collapse of the talks credited the protesters.
The protests were not there, then I think that some of these developing countries would feel that they are just on their own, you know. But having seen that even the American public is angry about how globalization, of course, WTO itself is affecting their own citizens, is a big factor in strengthening, I think, even these developing countries which are here.
While the labor march was large and peaceful, it was the unexpected violence that captured most of the media attention. But despite the chaos, Ron Judd believes labor still succeeded in getting its message through the fog of tear gas.
Seattle was huge. The issue of labor rights and environmental protection and human rights didn't get lost. You know, 36 hours of vandalism and exchanges between police and protesters aren't going to undermine or take away the very real and important discussion that started here in Seattle.
Essex Porter, Cairo 7, Eyewitness News.
As the city continues to recover from last week, many citizens want some answers.
And the man in the hot seat is Seattle Mayor Paul Schell. I talked with him about what happened during the WTO protests.
Happy that we had no casualties. There were a lot of people hurt. All of us are hurting about what happened here and trying to understand it. But I'm also feeling confident. I think that we got a great city and we came through something that I think is the 21st century right before us. And everybody got heard, and the WTO went on. They have a right of free speech as well. And a lot of ideas and thought is going on all over the world right now in terms of where are we going as a society. And so I think we even made a contribution. Right now, though, I'm focusing on let's get the facts so that we don't assign guilt and judgment prematurely.
Well, let's get the facts. People want to know what went into the planning process over the last 9 months.
From the city's standpoint, we had security. And at least 20 agencies were involved. We had the lead, but clearly the Secret Service, the FBI, all of the state and local agencies dealing with security, the Port of Seattle, ATF, and a lot of work from traveling to Geneva to looking at the NATO conference in Washington, D.C., trying to do the best they could to understand what both the threat was and then how to plan to do it.
Why did you underestimate the threat?
Well, it was an unprecedented area, and I don't know that that happened. What I've suggested is, and asked for, is let's do an assessment. Let's find out what was done right. People are entitled to know that. It's a good question.
Have you thought about what mistakes you made in retrospect?
Oh, I'm sure I did. I think we should all go through that analysis. It's too soon to do that, too. I want to hear, and we're going to be going through our own analysis. I'm comfortable we're now working with the council. We both have our responsibilities to see that we learn from our mistakes, understand it, learn from our mistakes, and then move on.
People calling for your resignation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it sort of goes with the job, doesn't it? There are people mad that I didn't act faster. There are people mad because I didn't act, that I acted too quickly. There are people mad that I used tear gas and embarrassed us to the country. Susan, I did everything I could as well as I could, and I was very well supported by the people in this community. I walk around town the last 3 or 4 days, and I get a lot of support out there saying they understand it was an impossible circumstance. And we got through it, and I think we got our nose bloodied, but our heads up, and we made it work.
Will Seattle ever be able to host another worldwide event again?
I think we're all going to take a long look at anyone that has the prospect of controversy. But I also hope that we don't shy away from that and try to be a comfortable city. Whether we like it or not, we're an important international city. And but I think a word of caution on who's going to pay for all of this and understanding of the risk we're asking our citizens to take.
How much longer do you want to serve the city of Seattle as mayor?
As long as they'll let me. I love this job. Is even in the height of where I was in, if I'm healthy, I feel proud about what I was able to do. I'm not happy about what I had to do. But in the end, you're measured by what you do and the results that you achieve, and not your instant popularity. I think it stretched me, but I think I grew as an individual as a result of it. But more than that, I think our whole community did. And my job now is to bring us together. Let's understand it together. Let's have all the facts out there. Let's not be afraid to admit mistakes. Let's learn from our mistakes. And like any good community, let's support each other in that process and be very forgiving. People said and did a lot of things on all sides that we need to, in this time of Christmas, peace and goodwill to all men. I think if we can come out of that, we'll be stronger as a community than we've ever been. Who wouldn't want to be mayor of that place?
Mayor Paul Schell. Well, it will be many weeks before there is a final accounting for what went wrong during the WTO. $17 million in losses in retail sales and services during the busy holiday season.
At least $3 million in damage to stores and businesses. But one thing is certain, the next time the world is watching Seattle, the city and its citizens will be better prepared.
We hope that the last hour and 10 minutes have helped shed some light on what happened during those historic 4 days in Seattle.
Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned. The news is next.
With complete Northwest news coverage, this is Cairo 7 Eyewitness News.
Seattle prosecutors tonight are rejecting a mass plea bargain deal pitched by WTO protesters. Most of the 500 people charged following last week's unrest face charges of failure to disperse and obstructing pedestrian traffic. Organizers say if the charges are not reduced, demonstrators plan to tie up the courthouse by demanding full jury trials. Last week, it was the streets WTO protesters were tying up, and it cost Seattle retailers millions. Cairo 7 Eyewitness News reporter Kevin McCarty is live downtown, where shop owners are trying to recover. Kevin?
Steve, retailers lost 4 precious days last week, and it even bled over into the weekend. Now there's fear that those who stayed away won't come back. This is downtown Seattle tonight, all dressed up and ready for Christmas shoppers. This was downtown Seattle a week ago tonight, the battleground where WTO demonstrators staged sit-ins and protests. At the height of the Christmas shopping season, merchants would like the public to forget this and go back to this. And there are some that are not leaving that to chance.
This weekend, officers that have now gotten a little bit of a nap, like myself, are going to come in on their days off. and walk some extra Christmas beats in that area, hoping that people will feel comfortable returning to the business core.
The Police Guild will also be selling WTO Battle of Seattle t-shirts, using those proceeds to buy gifts from downtown businesses hurt by last week's melee.
And then take all of those items that are purchased and contribute them to charities for the holidays.
The law firm of Karen Cross and Hempelman is going one better, giving each of 80 employees a crisp $100 bill, provided they spend it on Christmas gifts at downtown stores.
Why? Because we feel badly for the retailers who had to bear the brunt of the disturbances last week by closing their stores and having their windows broken and so forth.
Retailers say they lost millions of dollars because of last week's WTO protests and the shoppers who stayed away. The hope is people left their Christmas shopping until this weekend and will come down and shop in droves. Reporting live in Seattle, Kevin McCarty, Cairo 7 Eyewitness News.